Monica Vargas, number 31, Miss Della O, period 5. So, number 1, the Soviet Union, the Yalta Conference, and satellite nations. So the big three, which was Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, met in Yalta, Soviet Union, to discuss post-war life and mainly Germany, with negotiations like Stalin's quote-unquote free elections. They settled on a four-way division of Germany and East and West Berlin, dividing the areas between the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Stalin imposed satellite nations, or nations in which the Soviet Union had power over due to the implementation of communism in their governments. And these satellite nations were made up of Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Albania, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. So this picture on the bottom left is Stalin representing communism, and the picture on the top right is the big three in Yalta. This map represents the division of Germany as well as Berlin, and the second map represents the satellite nations. 2A, the Iron Curtain. So in the mid-1940s, Europe was facing a rather geographic political division, with a communist East and a democratic West. And the drastic political split soon developed the term, quote-unquote, the Iron Curtain, which represented the strong division of both sides. So this picture on the bottom left is a political cartoon about the Iron Curtain, and the picture on the top right is an actual map of where the Iron Curtain was. 2B, the United States and the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan was configured by George Marshall in June of 1947, and it was intended to aid Western Europe through wartime effects and chaos. Throughout the span of 4 years, the Marshall Plan allotted for $13 million to help aid and recover Western Europe in 16 countries. An unintended result of this was a spike in democratic support direct with the fallen communist appeal. And the picture on the bottom is George Marshall, and the picture on the top represents like somewhat of a logo for the Marshall Plan. 3A, History of Communist China, the beginning. So Chiang Kai-shek was the former nationalist leader of China, and he was fueled by US support and aid, in which he faced backlash from Chinese communists for around 20 years. But behind the scenes, Chiang Kai-shek ran a corrupt and crumbling government, which insidiously worked in weakening his nationalist support. For example, he imposed a grain tax during the famine of 1944. By 1945, northern Chinese people hopped on the train of communism as Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong appealed to many peasants. The US then attempted to keep peace despite favoring nationalists, as the Chinese Civil War sparked between the two political groups. So this picture on the bottom left is actually a picture of Mao Zedong, and the picture on the top right is a picture of Chiang Kai-shek. 3B, the reactions. So the People's Republic of China was established after the communist rule took over and Chiang and his associates made a break for Taiwan. Fear then erupted in the US after the communist victory in China, as Americans blamed the American government for allowing communism to spread. The picture on the left, the top, is a statue of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, and the picture on the bottom is a flag that just somewhat represents communism. 4A, the Korean War, background. So, Korea was now under Japanese rule, or an annexation, and it too ran into a geographic and political division, with soldiers in the south of the 38th parallel surrendering to democratic Americans and northern troops to the communist Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung led the newly formed communist-ruled, quote-unquote, Democratic People's Republic of Korea in North Korea, the capital being Pyongyang. And Syngman Rhee was the head of the South Korean Democratic Republic of Korea in South Korea, with the capital being in Seoul. So the picture on the bottom left is a picture of Syngman Rhee, and the picture on the top right is Kim Il-sung. The Korean War starts. The commencement of the Korean War occurred as the 38th parallel boundary was infiltrated by North Korean troops with intentions to invade South Korea. In order to defend, South Korea called the United Nations meeting in order to get a vote to stop North Korea, in which the vote passed as the Soviet Union was absent to the meeting in spite of Taiwan's presence. The United States and other countries in the United Nations supported South Korea through ocean fleets and troops under jurisdiction of General Douglas MacArthur. So the top picture is a map of the 38th parallel, and the bottom picture is a picture of General Douglas MacArthur. 4C, the Korean War, finalizing the fight. So, hopes were low as North Koreans were pushing South Koreans into a smaller and smaller zone near Pusan, conquering more land. But mid-September in 1950, under the command of MacArthur, troops were able to push back the North Koreans to their side of the 38th parallel and/or had them surrender to the Army of the United Nations. Chinese troops joined the battle in support of North Koreans, thus forcing the United Nations Army to retreat, leading to a dilemma of MacArthur wanting to push into China, but Truman ordering him not to. So, after Truman fired MacArthur for pushing boundaries, the Communists and Democrats settled for a negotiation of a demilitarized zone, prisoners, and a ceasefire line between June 1951 and July 1953. So the picture on the bottom is actually MacArthur and Truman arguing over this, and then the picture on the top represents the truce line. 5. United States CIA coup in the Middle East, 1951-1953. So, economy in Iran became rocky after Great Britain boycotted Iran's now nationalized oil. Americans feared that the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, would turn to his communist neighbors, the Soviet Union, for support in his plummeting economy. In hopes of returning power to Iran's former Shah, an American ally, the CIA granted several $1 million to funding against the Prime Minister. The funding worked, which allotted for the Shah to return to power and reverse the nationalization of oil, giving power back to the previous private Western companies. So, the picture on the top is actually Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, and the picture next to it is the logo for the Central Intelligence Agency. 6. The US and CIA coup in Guatemala, 1954. So the CIA intervened in Guatemalan affairs after allegations of sympathies to communists in the Guatemalan government. These rumors were spread after peasants were granted several 100,000 acres of land that the US claimed. In response, the US CIA wanted to invade and overthrow the president of Guatemala. Thus, they set up an army for this purpose. The president had no support in defense of the US Army, in turn resigning, and his predecessor was the army leader turned dictator. So the picture on the top is a map of Guatemala, and the picture on the bottom is Jacobo Arbenz, who was the former president of Guatemala. 7A. President Kennedy in the Cold War, the election of 1960. So John F. Kennedy, a former senator in Massachusetts, ran for president as a Democrat in 1960 against his Republican counterpart, Richard Nixon, and won. Many were weary of electing Kennedy due to his quote-unquote inadequate experience, being aged 43, as well as him being a strong Roman Catholic. So in late September, the two candidates debated for the first time ever on live television, and Kennedy won. He won hearts thanks to training from TV experienced producers. Kennedy also stole hearts by stepping up fearlessly during the Civil Rights Movement, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s infamous arrest. So these two pictures are both like shots from the debate that was televised. 7B, President Kennedy and the Cold War, the Camelot years. So the Kennedys, being the first family during the age of television, allowed the press to see into their lifestyle of elegance, hope, commitment, and sacrifice. From John's intelligence to his wife's fashion sense, everyone loved the Kennedys, dubbing their time, quote-unquote, the Camelot years, based on the musical. The quote-unquote best and brightest referred to Kennedy's associates, ranging from a dean at Harvard University to his brother. And the picture on the bottom is Kennedy, his wife, and their children, and then the picture on the top is like the cover of the playbook for the musical Camelot. 7C, President Kennedy and the Cold War, a new military policy. So, with the Cold War in mind, Kennedy would stop at nothing to prevent further spread of communism, claiming a focus on nuclear strategies. Not wanting to do too much nuke-wise, the flexible response was developed. This allowed increasing the ability of the US to fight without nuclear weapons. So, the balance of nuclear power between the United States and the Soviet Union was maintained while Kennedy simultaneously created the Green Berets, or Special Forces, through higher spending on defenses. The picture on the top is the logo for the Green Berets, or the Special Forces, and then the picture on the bottom is Kennedy discussing the flexible response. 8A, Kennedy, the Cuban Dilemma, and the Bay of Pigs. So, after Fidel Castro gained power as Cuba's new communist leader, tension rose with the United States as he meddled with Western oil refineries and commercial farms of the United States and Britain. Many Cubans loved that Castro was working with the Soviet Union and defending their country against the United States, while about 10% didn't and fled to the United States, specifically Miami, Florida. From March 1960 to April 1961, the Bay of Pigs operation was on, where the CIA trained Cuban exiles and they were there to overthrow Fidel Castro. But attempts failed and many exiles lost their lives or were imprisoned. After being humiliated through Cuban news, Kennedy accepted culpability and negotiated with Castro to release those imprisoned for about $53 million American dollars in aid. So the picture on the bottom is a map of Cuba and where the Bay of Pigs is, and then the picture on top is Fidel Castro. 8B, President Kennedy in Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 occurred as Kennedy found out about Cuban and Soviet intermingling on the basis of sharing nuclear weapons. Nikita Khrushchev supplied Cuba with Soviet weapons, Soviet support, and installed Soviet missile bases in Cuba. Kennedy, wanting this to stop, threatened the Soviet Union if Cuba were to set fire of their missiles. So after 6 days of tension, fear, and the United States preparing to physically confront the Soviet Union's ships, Khrushchev proposed an agreement for the U.S. to not invade Cuba so long he removed his nuclear missiles, and Kennedy agreed. 9A, the Vietnam War. So France had ties with Vietnam as they ruled Indochina through rubber and rice plantations. But the Vietnamese rebelled, leading to Ho Chi Minh creating the Revolutionary Indochinese Communist Party. Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam, now under Japanese rule, after fleeing due to French death threats for his rebellion, eventually forming the Viet Minh, which was a group who fought for Vietnamese independence. The United States went against their former friend Minh and financially supported France due to Minh's turn to the quote-unquote dark side, or communism. The Viet Minh drove out the French in May 1954 by overthrowing Dien Bien Phu, which was a French outpost. Then, in the following months of May to July, the countries involved set up the Geneva Accords, splitting Vietnam into the northern communist and southern anti-communist nationalists, or the 17th parallel. So, the bottom picture represents where the 17th parallel split is, and the top picture is a picture of Ho Chi Minh. 9B, the Vietnam War. So, Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem wanted to cancel elections as he was anti-communist and didn't want Minh to win. And he even set up a negotiation with the United States, but didn't hold up to his part. Viet Cong was a group of communists who attacked Diem's corrupt government through Minh support and supply through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So Kennedy supported Diem in the fear of seeming to be a communist sympathizer, but with too much corruption against Kennedy, the United States sent over a coup to weaken Diem. Eventually, Diem was assassinated, and Kennedy too within a few weeks. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution started off of missiles fired between American destroyers, specifically the USS Maddox, which was in the Gulf for secret raids against North Vietnam, and Vietnamese patrol boats, in which President Johnson prompted bombings to North Vietnam in order to quote-unquote defend against their attacks. So this picture is actually on the top Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the Vietnamese president, and on the bottom was President Kennedy and his wife before his assassination. 10. A divided nation. So many American men didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War, despite the draft calling them in as mandatory soldiers. Yet, young men found many ways around this quote-unquote easy-to-manipulate draft, such as going to university, getting a medical extension, etc. African Americans served mostly in ground combat, making up for 20% of the ground combat deaths, leading to the instillment of a draft lottery system in which roles were randomly selected in 1969. Racism was so high in the troops that violent outbreaks occurred towards African American soldiers. Even Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out about the irony of African Americans dying in a respectful way for a country that did not respect them. Also, thousands of women contributed to serving in the war as nurses with the Red Cross and with the United States Service Organization. So the picture on the top are some African American soldiers during the Vietnam War, and the picture on the bottom are some women nurses during the Vietnam War. 11. The Tet Offensive turns the war. So many Americans started to develop negative views on the war as Viet Cong and northern Vietnamese troops started surprise attacking many places during Tet, or the beginning of the Lunar New Year. The Viet Cong had their surprise attacks hidden with the festivities of Tet, including hiding weapons in coffins at quote-unquote funerals for Vietnamese war soldiers, which then were used to attack a multitude of cities like Saigon and US Air Force bases. These attacks, or the Tet Offensive, eventually led to an overpowering loss for the northern Vietnamese, but American civilians and all citizens alike collectively lost support for the war. President Johnson also lost support, even though friend Clark Clifford, as many saw no end, stated that US casualties were just not worth it. So the picture on the left is supposed to be President Johnson, and the picture on the right is a map of the Tet Offensive. 12A, the end of the war and its legacy. So, the My Lai massacre, which occurred in March 1968 in My Lai, Vietnam, was a tragic event in which Lieutenant William Calley Jr. commanded his troops to, quote-unquote, kill anything that breathed, whilst in search of Viet Cong soldiers, ending in over 200 casualties of innocent women, children, and elderly villagers. In April/May of 1970, around 1.5 million college students nationwide closed over 1,000 schools in protest after learning from President Nixon that United States troops invaded Cambodia in hopes and attempts of ridding Viet Cong and northern Vietnamese supplying centers. So the picture on the bottom is President Nixon, and the picture on the top is actually a survivor from the My Lai massacre. 12B, the end of the war and its legacy. At Kent State University, the wild protests where students were throwing rocks at the National Guard and even burned down the ROTC building ended in 9 wounded and 4 dead, as the National Guard had been ordered to commence fire into the groups on May 4th, 1970. Within the next weeks, 12 were wounded and 2 died at Jackson State due to similar circumstances, resulting in controversial debates, the formation of quote-unquote hard hats who supported the government, and a rally outside New York City Hall, also in support of the government. The picture on the bottom is in protest of the Jackson State and Kent University shootings, and the picture on the top is a picture of protesters at Kent State. Thank you.